Imagine waking up a few days after Christmas, with your family still in a festive mood, and in less than 1 minute, everything you know simply ceases to exist. Your home, your street, your entire city. It sounds like a nightmare, doesn't it? But that is exactly what happened in Messina, Italy. On December 28th, this is the story of the earthquake that turned a Sicilian paradise into a living hell on earth, just days before the turn of the year. And what I'm about to tell you today is not only about a natural disaster, but about the human horror that came afterwards, something few people know about. At 5:20 in the morning, the ground shook with a violence modern Europe had never witnessed. A magnitude 7.1 earthquake, but with an epicenter so shallow and so close to the city that its destructive power was amplified in a brutal way. In just 37 seconds, more than 90% of Messina's buildings collapsed. But this was no ordinary collapse. The architecture of the time, with heavy wooden beams and stone walls, caused the structures to implode. Roofs fell onto the beds where families were sleeping, crushing parents, children, and grandparents instantly. Those who had the luck or the misfortune to survive the initial collapse awoke inside a tomb of dust and darkness. Imagine the scene. You are trapped beneath tons of rubble, perhaps with a broken arm, barely able to breathe. Beside you, you hear the voice of your brother, your mother, or your child. You talk, try to calm each other, promise that help will come. But the hours pass, and the voices around you begin to fall silent, one by one. First the weakest, then those who lose hope. Small children cried for their parents, their calls echoing through the debris, until exhaustion and dehydration overcame them, and silence took over. Survivors described this psychological torment as worse than any physical pain. Being alive, listening to your entire family die slowly beside you. But the terror did not stop there. While the city collapsed, something sinister was happening at sea. The waters of the Strait of Messina suddenly receded, exposing the seabed. Some dazed survivors who managed to escape the rubble saw the beach as a path to safety. They ran toward the sea, perhaps hoping to find boats or simply to get away from buildings that could still collapse. It was a deadly trap. About 10 minutes after the earthquake, a tsunami with waves up to 12 meters high crashed onto the coast with unimaginable fury. Those on the beach were swallowed by the wall of water. Those who did not drown were dragged back into the sea, torn apart by the debris carried by the wave. The water flooded what remained of the city, filling the lower floors of collapsed buildings and drowning those trapped below. The earthquake destroyed from above, and the tsunami annihilated from below. In the days that followed, Messina became a city of the dead. But what makes this story truly disturbing is what happened to the living. Help was slow to arrive. The first rescue teams, made up of sailors from Russian and British ships nearby, encountered an apocalyptic scene. There was no government, no police, no order, only desperate survivors, and the stench of death hanging over everything. And here is where the story takes an even darker turn. A detail many historical accounts prefer to ignore. Beneath the rubble, thousands of people were still alive, trapped and screaming for help. The screams were constant, day and night, a chorus of agony that drove rescuers and survivors to the brink of madness. The rescue task was monumental and nearly impossible. There were too many bodies to remove, too many fires to control, and the constant risk of further collapses. Amid this chaos, a terrible order was allegedly given to some Italian soldiers who arrived days later. To spare suffering and preserve the sanity of rescue teams, they were instructed to silence the most desperate cries. Unofficial reports and military diaries from the time mentioned that in cases where rescue was impossible, soldiers shot trapped victims to end their agony, a brutal mercy, carried out in cold blood. Desperation to prevent epidemics led to further atrocities. With the heat and the vast number of decomposing bodies, the risk of diseases like cholera and typhus was imminent. The solution was mass cremation. Giant funeral pyres were built in city squares, but in the rush and chaos, there was no time to carefully check whether everyone thrown onto the piles was truly dead. Survivors reported seeing people still breathing, or making weak movements, being thrown into the fires along with corpses. It was a race against time, and the life of an individual who might still be saved weighed less than the risk of an epidemic that could kill thousands. People were buried alive, burned alive. Collective survival instinct overwhelmed any remaining sense of humanity. The final death toll is uncertain, but estimates ranged between 80,000 and 120,000 people, including Messina and the neighboring city of Reggio Calabria, which was also devastated. Bodies were piled in the streets like garbage, waiting to be burned or dumped into mass graves. Orphaned children, their eyes empty with shock, wandered through the ruins, searching for parents they would never see again. A city that days earlier had been preparing to celebrate the new year now lay in absolute silence. When December 31st arrived, there was no celebration, no fireworks, no lights, only darkness, the silence of the dead, and the muffled crying of the few who remained. It was, without a doubt, the darkest New Year's Eve in Italian history. Why does this story still disturb us more than a century later? Because it reminds us of an uncomfortable truth. The horror is not only in the fury of nature, but in what we become when pushed to the absolute limit. The Messina earthquake is not a horror legend. It is not a movie. It was real. The impossible decisions, the acts of cruelty disguised as mercy, the choice of who lives and who dies, of it happened. It is a cruel reminder that, for many people, the promise of a happy new year can be brutally cut short, and that the true hell may begin when the earth stops shaking. This story forces us to reflect on the fragility of our civilization and of our own humanity. What would you do in a situation like this? Would you be a hero, a victim, or someone forced to make a monstrous decision? Leave your opinion in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep analysis of a little-known historical event, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.